Fritz and Nijole, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure, I'll let Nijole start.
Yeah, so my name's pronounced Nijole. It's a Lithuanian name. I'm the daughter of immigrants who escaped from the Soviet occupation of their country, Lithuania, and born and raised here in the States, and was raised a devout Catholic. I was very, very devoted when I was in grammar school. I actually, when I was 11, saw some serious hypocrisy in the way that the priests lived as opposed to what they were teaching us and punishing us for. And that was when the scales fell off my eyes. And I said, okay, I don't believe in this anymore. And I started searching for what to believe in. Now, as a backdrop, Lithuania was the last country in Europe to take on Christianity. And the Grand Duke christened the country because it kept getting invaded by crusaders. So, the people kind of knew that it was something you had to practice to keep the authorities happy, but they kept up their ancient earth-based pagan religious traditions. So the way that I was raised, we went to church on Sundays. I went to Catholic grammar school and subsequently Catholic all-girl high school and Catholic university as well. But at home, we kept up a lot of the ancient, pagan traditions. We didn't call them pagan. We just called them Lithuanian folk traditions. So I was kind of raised with both. And of course, as I said, I figured out that the Catholic authorities were, the way that I interpreted as an 11-year-old, lying to me. And I started a lifetime of spiritual seeking and found my home in metaphysics. But I always was interested and saw the parallels between the holidays that we celebrate, like Easter, Christmas, and so forth, and the pagan traditions that really gave birth to those holidays, and interpreted it as Christianity co-opted the pagan holidays. And then, of course, when I got together with my husband, Fritz, we both really delved into the pagan origins of some of these holidays. And I'll hand it over to you.
Okay. So, well, my odyssey kind of started, actually, I was born in Mexico City. And as a result of my father, who's from Pennsylvania, and he's Germanic and Danish descent, but he was a scientist type, and he was a meteorologist in the Navy. And he went to Mexico to basically study their archaeology. And that's where he met my mother. So my mother's a super devoted Catholic, but very sweet and very kind of flowing with it. But she definitely wanted for me to grow up in that world, and become to get what's the word they use?
Christened, baptized.
Christened, and I got baptized and all that. But anyway, the having my father, who was agnostic basically, and he always just called it hocus pocus. So I was kind of straddling these two worlds because my mother, she'd take me to church, and and back then it was in Latin in Mexico, because I grew up a lot in Latin America and in Mexico and Venezuela, Puerto Rico, a lot of Latin, and off and on going to Pennsylvania and California and Texas and things. So I had a very scattered childhood, but kind of being straddled between those two worlds, I wasn't neither here nor there. I was pulled a bit by the mystical aspects of the church because I kind of thought it was kind of cool, but it was weird. And I felt like the God that was the Christian God, the Catholic God, was kind of mean-spirited to me. That's the way I took it, because he's punishing and these rules that I didn't really feel were fair. And I actually got mad at God when I was about 12. I had a little conversation with him and told him, I don't like you. I don't like your policies, basically. And if this is the way you're going to play the game, I'm not on board. And so I was just open to try to find something else, And oddly enough, there was this book in our home library in Mexico City. I went to the American school there, but out of nowhere, this book by Lapsang Rampa about the third eye was this fellow who came from Tibet. He had been a Tibetan monk. And I pulled it out, and I don't know, I found it very intriguing. I read that book, and I thought, a lot of the philosophy in here just appeals to me a lot more. It doesn't have all this guilt and all this kind of punishing aspects of it. And so that opened me up, and I started looking at other philosophies, and that led me to a lot of things. I started learning about hypnosis, self-hypnosis. There was the Silva mind control techniques that were very popular in Mexico when I was a teenager, and I studied that stuff, and that really opened the door for me, because I started going, doing these, what you might call meditation now, but it was just going into an alpha state, basically, and learning to get into those deeper levels of brain waves, and I found them very creative. And the thing that was really motivating me was music. Actually, it was what was happening on the radio, and everything was exciting. And so I dove into music, and I studied, because of my mother being Spanish descent. She actually got me a guitar teacher who taught me flamenco, of all things. So I kind of jumped into a virtuosic style of playing, and my dad was really into classical music. He kind of turned me on to Stravinsky and things like that. I like pop music, but I got into the progressive stuff, and so I always liked stuff that was a little more intelligent, a little more adventurous. And then the world music thing influenced me. So that's kind of my backdrop. And then I was going to become a professional musician, basically. And I went out to California to Los Angeles, and then slammed into the commercial aspect of the industry there. It wasn't where my head was at. I was more, I guess, adventurous and pure, and wanting to do something original.
Artistic,
yeah. And LA is such a commercialized town, but being there, kind of running amok a bit with the industry there, I ended up being pulled into the film industry. I started meeting people that were in the effects world, and they were much cooler. They were more technicians, and loved technology and stuff. So I maneuvered more into that world, and then that led me more into documentary work. But I was still doing music primarily, though I was getting experience in a lot of other aspects of production. And so I my first big break basically was doing the music for an NBC special with Charlton Heston called Mystery of the Sphinx. And that was my kind of thing, because my dad being an archaeologist. In fact, when they saw that I had that background growing up on pyramids and things in Mexico, they thought, oh yeah, you're kind of a shoo-in for this kind of work. And I ended up writing this Egyptian music for an NBC special. I ended up winning an Emmy, and that was the highest rated news special of all time when it aired. So it was very exciting. It was kind of, so I ended up going more in that direction. And I ended up, we formed a post-production facility doing documentary work. We got a little political. We had a successful show called the Hidden Wars of Desert Storm, which was an expose of the Gulf War
in the early 90s.
Yeah. So at that point, I wasn't editing. I was just focusing on the music, and then getting more in the production side. But then I had a editor buddy who, I'd watch him edit, and I thought, this is a lot like music. And so I kind of later, when we met Joseph Atwell, he took an interest in us, because he was looking, he wrote this book. The first version of the book was this one here. Caesar's Messiah, the Roman Conspiracy to Invent Jesus. So when we met him, he invited us over for a dinner party, and he laid this book out on the table, and it was like, whoa, that's quite a title.
We were already exploring the pagan aspects and the true origins of Christianity, and he brought this whole other piece in, with it being a creation by the Flavians. And before I met Joe, I believed that Jesus Christ was a historical figure that really existed. And it actually, he asked me to re-edit that book, because he wanted to include the latest part of his thesis, which was the Flavin Signature. So I had the privilege of working on this book, and it's Joe's thesis. I just went through to make sure that it was clear.
It was a new edition, basically.
Yeah, this is the new edition, and me being a lay person, unfamiliar with this kind of stuff, it was good for me to go through it, to really ask him a ton of questions and pick his brain. What did you mean when you wrote this? What did you mean? And the more I studied it, and of course, this is mainly an analysis of the writings, the literature, the New Testament, and Josephus's histories that he compares it to. And having gone through the arc of going through this book, inch by inch, word by word, I suddenly, everything clicked, because I was such a devoted student of Christianity and Catholicism that what he said, rang a bell for me. It's like, oh, that story, that's right, I remember that. And I had read the whole Bible when I was a kid. And everything that he put in here just made so much sense that he's taking over his way of looking at the thesis and the origin of the New Testament.
And she mentioned the Flavians. When we first met Joe, I mean, he basically took me back into his room and started showing me some of his research. And frankly, he lost me, because in much as I liked history and I knew a lot of Egyptian history, and I knew quite a bit of Roman history, but the Flavians, I don't know, it was a blind spot for me.
They're not a household name.
And so when he was even using that term, I didn't know what it meant, and I went home after, because he gave me the book, and I went home, and the first thing I looked up was that word Flavian. I go, what is that word? And then I started getting some context. So we ended up, because we were living near him, and we started this association where he basically, in a sense, where he mentored us in a sense into this concept. But I tell you, it really made sense. From everything else I knew, it started really. It had the most explanatory power. Certainly, a lot more than the Gospels are. That Jesus is this magical being that walks on water and stuff. It just it had a lot more reality to it to me. Of like, okay, this. But for us, it was really about getting the context of what was going on at the time, because Joe will very quickly get into some of the minutiae of where his theory really is anchored.
Analysis, his textual analysis.
Yeah, and what makes his research unique. But when we decided to make a film about it, which he was basically wanting us to do, we realized, he's so deep into the scholarship and the minutiae, and we need to pull back. But we didn't really follow his books precisely. We took the essence of it.
When you're going to make a film, you can't just do literary analysis. There has to be something visual. There has to be a story. There has to be something that engages people on a video level. So even though the film Caesar's Messiah is all of our scholars being talking heads and explaining, we try to make a story out of it that people could follow the history of these Flavian emperors and give it the historical context like we're talking about.
Yeah, because once you understand who all the players are, and then you can kind of understand their motivations and probably what probably happened from all that. You could press it at that point. And so that actually made it a challenge, because it wasn't like telling the story about Caesar or Nero or something that a lot of people are familiar with. We had to start from scratch with who the Titus Flavius was. And of course, what we found out is in Jewish circles, if you get into Judaism, they know Titus, because he's as infamous as Adolf Hitler to them, because he destroyed their temple, and
it's the Wailing Wall.
It's the Wailing Wall
that's left of it today.
Yeah, of their temple. So it's interesting that Jewish people kind of relate to it a lot more than Christians do, because it's not. You don't hear about Titus Flavius in the New Testament. I mean, there is some Titus references, but they're obscure.
They're not referred to as the Caesar
of
Caesar.
Rome. Yes.
There's a character named Titus. there was a Gospel of Titus, I think, that was thrown out.
So you've seen the film, right, Tom?
I think so, a while ago, not recently.
Uh-huh.
But could you tell us more about the evidence and justification? How do you get to the conclusion that Jesus was invented? Who was he invented by? Why is that? Because it seems like the academic consensus leans more towards that he was a real person, but a lot of the story was embellished. So what led you to this conclusion?
Well, see, here's one key thing. It's like you say what most historians think, that he was a real person, but what are they basing that on? They've got the four Gospels, and you got the work of Josephus, which is just a few little mentions there about Jesus, and Tacitus. And what we realized was, well, all the references are kind of coming from the Roman sphere. The scholars are Josephus and Tacitus and Dio and whatnot, and then the Gospels are literature. They're not historical documents. In fact, they didn't even know who wrote those things till much later. It became a...
Well, we're not scholars, so this isn't really our purview, to be able to explain it as well as the scholars do. But some of the things that did ring a bell with me, well, the most compelling thing was how Jesus in the Gospel says that the Son of Man is going to come before this generation is over and destroy the temple. Now, to this day, contemporary Christians are still waiting for this Son of Man. But according to Joe Atwell and, Ken Humphreys, Rod Blacker's number of other people, lots of people are already forming this Roman provenance thesis. The destruction of the temple, historically, as historians know, was done by Titus Flavius. So, there's nobody else who came and destroyed the temple. So he must be the Son of Man that Jesus is referring to. And he did come exactly within 40 years from the dating in the Gospels, where Jesus supposedly spoke at around 30 AD, somewhere around there. And the temple was destroyed, 73? I think it was 73 AD. So it's like, what are they referring to? They must be referring to Titus. And then there's other historians of the era, Suetonius and Tacitus, who declared Titus and Vespasian to be the Jewish Messiah, the ultimate end of the messianic prophecies, the Messiah the Jews were waiting for. And they're saying, that's it, it's the Flavians. Now, in today's Christianity or theology, all of that stuff that was true back then somehow got forgotten, got swept under the rug, or perhaps got hidden deliberately. And, these are things that today we can never prove. How do we know really what happened? But our interest as filmmakers, not as scholars, was that this is an interesting thesis that deserves to be shown the light of day, and it deserves to have people start speaking about it, bring it into the public debate. Let's have other scholars debate, Joe Atwell. We're not capable of that, but we love bringing scholars together. And we found a small group of scholars that arrived at the same thesis through different directions. And that, just adds a little more credibility to what Joe Atwell is saying.
Well, my question is more like, it seems like most historical figures have very, very little evidence. The vast majority of people who lived in the past, we have no evidence for. But we tend to believe they exist based on very tiny, tiny things that are essentially nothing that we would compare to like today's court standards. And based on that, we could essentially criticize any historical character and say they didn't exist. And because we have so little evidence, if we have a higher standard of what we would need to make it reasonable to believe these people existed, we could essentially discount the vast majority of people in history. But if we accept in general that there's some evidence that there's accounts of these people and that probably meant they existed, like if your neighbor tells you they saw a dog yesterday, you're probably going to believe him because it's just such a mundane claim. It seems like the same could apply to Jesus existing or any person in history existing. That it's just, okay, there's a guy who has this name who did a couple things that are pretty unmiraculous. Like, yeah, fine. I don't see why I would doubt that. And I don't see why it would be necessary for this person to be completely invented from nothing, as opposed to grounded in a real person. Like if I was, for example, Roman or something, and I wanted the Jews to become more docile, I wouldn't just make up an entirely fictitious character who none of them believed in. That wouldn't make any sense. Like
But you know what?
The truth is he wasn't made up.
Out of nothing.
The truth is that these stories of a miraculous God-man started in ancient Babylon.
It's like a prototype, because when you look at the Jesus figure, you know, you got people like others like Mithra and
Osiris, the sun god myths. So Tim Freak is a fabulous scholar on this topic that you're talking about right here. And he says that in the mystery religions, which predate Christianity by 500, 600, 700, 800 years, I don't know, but many centuries, there was always a God-man that performed miracles, turned water into wine, had 12 followers, was accused of going against the government, was put to death, and then was reincarnated, resurrected. And that's what is known as the sun god myth. So the sun, you know, winter solstice is when it's at its nadir, its lowest point, and then it's reborn around the solstice, which is why we celebrate Christmas. The days start getting longer, and that is the rebirth of the sun god, who then, you know, goes on to be replenished at spring equinox, and that's why we celebrate Easter and all that. So the Jesus story came from many pagan stories, and there is even a Christian theologian whose name I forget that said that these stories they came from the popular novels of the time, the popular fiction in Greek, Egyptian, and Roman literature of the time. So he was not made up out of nothing.
No, I think they purposely wanted to have something familiar that the public would have resonance with. You know, I kind of liken it sometimes to the movie The Matrix, how they use the going down the rabbit hole, the Alice in Wonderland story is kind of a foundation to anchor it, to use as a metaphor throughout the whole movie. And it gives everybody a kind of a touchstone that they can, an anchor to, that they can, you know, understand that storyline. I think my own, you know, belief is that the Romans writing these gospels for political reasons, they wanted to use these popular themes that people could relate to, because if you did start from something scratch, I think it'd be too esoteric. You know, people wouldn't relate to it.
And the purpose really was to combine the popular pagan religions of the day with some of the Jewish beliefs, like the belief in a Messiah coming. And so they combined all of those stories together to create this new myth. And the purpose was to paganize Judaism. Now, this is not unprecedented. In the Old Testament, we have an account of the Persian king sending Ezra and he was Jewish, but he was in the Persian government, sending Ezra back to Jerusalem, to the Jews in Jerusalem, with a new version of the Torah. And the Jews were resistant, and they're saying, where did you get this about reincarnation? Jews don't believe in reincarnation. Where did you get this about the last day of judgment? Where did you get that Satan is now an evil force instead of God's right hand angel? Oh, we get it. You're combining Zoroastrianism with Judaism. And actually, the six-pointed Jewish star is an influence of the Persian Zoroastrianism. So the Persians were trying to combine their beliefs with Judaism. And this has happened so many times. The Babylonians did it, the Syrians, is that what they were called? Sumerians, I think. But so it's not unprecedented that the Romans would try to combine paganism with Judaism.
Well,
Yes.
my question is more that not obviously the stories were influenced by previous stories, but if the Romans were trying to invent a god figure to pacify the Jews, why would they invent a person from nothing instead of picking one of the thousands of different people who claim to be messiahs and who are doing all these miracles? Because these miracles, like turning water into wine, extremely common. Lots of people are doing this stuff. So it seems like they could have picked one of those guys who was relatively popular and
And
made
let's-
him into a messiah of some kind rather than invent him from nothing, in which
Well-
case Jesus would have existed as a human, and that would seems to make more sense.
Let's put it this way. There are some scholars, and of course we can't prove any of this, but there are some scholars that believe that if Jesus existed, and actually Joe has this in his book, Joe Atwell has this in his book, he believed it was the real person who existed. Joe called him
Eliezer.
or Eleazar, however you say that name. And he was a rebel, a Jewish rebel that was leading the Jews against Rome in a warrior-like, messianic war. And it's possible that the Romans took, one of these messiahs and decided to turn the story around, that he is not against Rome. He's pro-Roman. He's praising the Roman soldiers. Walk a mile for the Roman soldier, carry his knapsack on your back, pay your taxes, render to Caesar what is Caesar's. Don't forget that the authorities are appointed by God. So all of these pro-Roman teachings are put into the mouth of Jesus. And it's possible that there was a huge following of one of the messiahs that was a warrior. And once the Flavians destroyed the temple and destroyed Jerusalem, they all decided, okay, we know who's in charge now. We're not going to stick our necks out. We will go along with the fact that our Messiah was pro-Roman and peaceful and trying to get along with everyone in Rome. So that is a possible theory.
And not to say that there wasn't a Jesus Christ. I mean, we'll never know, actually. But the thing is that the name is suspicious because it's more of a title, Savior, Messiah, basically.
Jesus means Savior, Christ means Messiah. And Joe Atwell is like, who would name their little child Savior Messiah,
Yeah, it seems a little too convenient, but it's possible that if, let's say the Romans did invent that name, that title and that character, it could have very well be based on one of the many string of messiahs, because what would happen is that the more radical Jews that were wanting to free themselves from Rome, they would basically look for a messiah because it was prophesied one would come, and then they'd see somebody who seemed like maybe that's the person. They'd get behind him and follow him until they were killed. And they go, okay, I guess that wasn't the one.
I guess God wasn't behind him.
Yeah, so there was a whole string of these guys, and Eliezer was, I think, the one Atwell feels was the model for Christ.
I feel like he said that Eliezer was crucified between two others. So that kind of gives us
Josephus tells that story
symbolism of the crucifixion.
Of the three being crucified and they're taken down and one survives, which is, we assume
that's right. That's one of Joe's parallels.
Yeah, it's one of his parallels. So it's there's a lot of things that are too convenient, I guess, when you look at the fact that there's no actual historical record from the Roman side, or the one fellow Philo of Alexandria, who was
why is that convenient? Because the Romans didn't make historical records of the vast majority of people they crucified. So that doesn't seem convenient. That seems like you would be expected.
Well, only because this guy would have stood out, I guess, more than just any rebel. That if he could perform these miracles, because that's why I was going to mention Philo, because Philo was running around during that period Jesus supposedly lived.
Philo lived in Judea, and he was writing about what's going on in Judea at the time that Jesus would have been alive. Somewhere between 30 and 60 AD was when Philo wrote. And the fact that he never mentioned a miracle worker, a healer, somebody who's, turning the Jews around by storm and gathering followers.
It's not a big, vast area. The Levant is fairly small. So that kind of, he would have heard about that, you would think. But again, we just don't know. It's just interesting that he never mentions it. And
some of the things that come to mind are like, if the Romans were trying to invent a gospel, then why would they write it in Greek? Like, they know the Jews don't like Greek. That's like a bad sign for them. So wouldn't they write it in Aramaic?
But the Jews that were living in the Roman Empire, they call it the lingua franca, because it's kind of like English is now in the world. You go to Europe and everybody now, all the youth, they all speak English now. They're all taught it in schools. So
I was under the impression that at the time, like, there are many scholars who say that the Jewish elite, the people who were running the thing, really hated Greek and thought it was unorthodox to the religion.
But here's the thing: see, the people that were actually running Judea were pro-Roman, because you got the Herods and the Alexanders, and so you have the nobility in the sense that are living a good lifestyle, that they live in their palaces and things, and they're doing just fine, and they're working with the Romans. But it's really what you have. The revolt is not those people. It's what they call the Sicarii and the Zealots. These are people that think of them as like the Taliban or something.
The extremists.
Yeah, they're living out on the frontier, and they're like saying, you know what, these guys are traitors, and they knew Herod wasn't even Jewish, so he was pretending to be. He converted so that he had more legitimacy, but there's a lot of forces wanting to keep the system because it's stable, and then you have these basically terrorist groups that are out on the frontier raiding and destroying Jewish palaces.
There were a lot of different factions within Jews themselves as well. There's pro-Roman Jews who have, government jobs in the Roman government. They're being the tax collectors. They're ruling Judea, and they're, just converted to be Jews and so forth.
Well, just to clarify, the goal of the document would be to pacify the Jews that didn't agree with the Romans. And so it wouldn't make sense for the Jews to make a document that agrees with the Jews who are already in agreement with them. Like that, what would be the point?
I got your point of view, and there are other scholars who have different points of view on this as well. So maybe this is not necessarily Joe Atwell's point of view.
Actually, Joe's point of view is that it was just on the frontier. What they were trying to do was stop the expansion of Judaism, of that zealotry movement. So it wasn't so much in Judea; it was actually on the frontiers of Rome, really. So it was just trying to stop the expansion, not just kill the core of it.
But the interesting thing is that literature of any type of that era could only be accessed by educated people. As you say, the extremists and the zealots would not have access to it. So some scholars say that these literary works were aimed at other scribes that would then go out and teach their people, their followers, their congregants, whatever you want to call them. And that's why it's written in Greek, because all the scribes, all the educated people, all the scholars were the ones that were doing the copying. They were the ones that were disseminating the works. They knew all the symbolism
the Old
of
Testament,
all the passages.
The Old Testament had been translated to Greek.
Exactly. So it was kind of the overarching international language of the day for the educated people to get the concept, which then the people like the zealots and extremists, they would only get through word of mouth. They wouldn't read. That, most people didn't read in those days. They couldn't. They didn't have access. So, but it got disseminated that way. And of course, there was plenty of other Roman propaganda pointing to this. There were the Roman coins. There were the Roman roads. There were many other ways of getting the word out.
Well, so for example, if that was the case, why do the Gospels disagree with each other? Why would
Yeah.
they write a propaganda piece that disagrees with its own propaganda piece? That seems like
You
bad
know,
propaganda.
I think probably the answer to that is that they were written at different times for different provinces,
Different
groups, and
they were revised and they were rewritten to suit, and plus, after the fall of the Flavian dynasty, Christianity actually fell out of vogue for a little while. And it was only with the Second Jewish War with Hadrian that he had to bring it back again to try to quell the rebellion again. And after that period, when it was not yet an official religion of Rome, the people took the stories and revised them in all different directions, all different ways. There were so many vast different varieties of Christianity. And it wasn't until the Council of Nicaea under Constantine that it got codified and unified. So it's not at all a stretch to think that there would be contradictions and different groups writing different versions. It was an evolution that started happening.
The thing that Joe kind of points out, though, is that the one thing that unifies the Gospels is what he calls the Flavin Signature, which, and even if you don't take all those parallels, but there's these parallel stories that are kind of, between Titus's military campaign and Jesus' ministry, that and there's a core of them that are really pretty uncanny, the way they operate. And then he feels, well, that stayed intact despite these variations of over hundreds of years. Because, the Gospels that we have, we don't have any original ones from the first century. That we have tiny little fragments and things. The Gospels that we're reading these days
are second, third century. And fourth century is when they got codified.
So it was,
and then there was the King James version that is like one of the most popular versions. So, this is a living, breathing, evolving work.
Oh, so why would we prefer the idea that this was written by the Romans as opposed to, as you mentioned, there are lots of different versions of Judaism at the time, and some of them were very amicable to Roman society. And so it seems like it's plausible that these were written by the more pacifistic Jew figures, and the Romans simply adopted them or promoted them because they happened to be more pacifistic towards the Roman Empire. Why go so far as to say that this must have been invented by the Romans entirely rather than simply already using the groups of Jews that they agreed with at the time?
Well, the Romans were notorious for destroying anything that did not go along with their agenda. And because there's so much pro-Roman sentiment and message in the New Testament, you have to assume that the Romans are promoting this. Now, whether the Flavians sat down and wrote it, I don't think so, because they're emperors. They don't sit and write. But we do know that emperors commissioned writers. The Flavians commissioned Josephus to write the War of the Jews, which is the history of the Flavian battles. I mean, just like Augustus commissioned Virgil to write the Aeneid so that the Julio-Claudians would look like they're descended from Venus and therefore should be worshipped as gods. That was just something that the Romans did. I wouldn't be surprised. Again, we don't have evidence for it, but I wouldn't be surprised if the well-educated Jews that were in government, the scribes working for the Flavians, were commissioned by the Flavians to write this. Now, one of the things that point, there's many things that point to a Roman origin, but one of the things that I found very effective to prove that point is
Compelling.
Thank you. That's the word. So is the structure of the church today. So the structure has got deacons, then the priests are above them, then the bishops are above them, the cardinals are above them, and it all ends up in the Pope at the top. The Pope is called the Pontifex Maximus. So the early Roman Caesar cults that were, the imperial cults that were created to worship Caesar as a god had deacons, priests, bishops, cardinals, and they called the head of the imperial cult the Pontifex Maximus. So the structure of the church, even the headdresses, the reason the bishops wear those kind of fish heads on their heads to this day, it was used in pagan times as part of the Caesar cult to worship Caesar as a god. And as we know, the Jews did not want to worship Caesar as a god. It was against their religion. They could not have any graven images. And this is one way that the Romans got the Jews, or attempted to get the Jews to worship Caesar as a god.
Well, it was a hellacious war. It was no minor skirmish. It was really bloody. And the Jews actually pushed the Romans out of Judea. I mean, that was at the point that Nero basically said, okay, we got to do something about this, especially when Rome burned. And there's a pretty substantial theory that it was the Jewish rebels that actually burned Rome. It was in the same timing and everything, and they had the motivation. But and as far as the literature goes, I'm not sure what other Jewish literature you're referring to, because the Old Testament, it pretty much was kept secret, in the temple, and it wasn't really till Titus took the temple, and they grabbed that literature, and they actually took it back to Rome and analyzed it, because they were actually pretty befuddled. I think what's motivating this rebellion, because these guys are fanatical. They're willing to die, in vast numbers and sustain tremendous torture and everything for this belief that they had, and it didn't flow with the Roman, because the Romans were pretty open to other religions, but monotheistic Jews was so
well, they were very exclusive,
yeah.
So they wouldn't blend in with the vast Roman Empire. Romans were on a mission to conquer the world, and they wanted to subsume all these different cultures and make them all Romans. And the Jews were like, we're exclusive. We are the chosen ones. We do not become Romanized. And they were really wanting to stick with what they considered to be the identity of their nation and their culture.
If you look at what happened there after the destruction of the temple, you have the Hebrew religion prior to the destruction of the temple, and right afterwards you have rabbinical Judaism, and it's quite different. Because the Hebrews, they have these traditions of cutting the throats of animals and throwing the blood on you and blessing you, and they have priests, and then suddenly it shifts after the war, and you have rabbis, which are teachers, and you have a benign kind of form of Judaism that it's at that point anyway is not looking for a Messiah at this point. Now that comes back later, because I think as the Roman Empire waned, rabbinical Judaism, some of the core issues that go back all the way to the Torah come back and reassert themselves.
Well, to answer your question about the other documents, we know of like 40 Gospels. There's lots and lots of Gospels that were written during the time period by lots of different people. And
if you're talking about the Nag Hammadi
no, that's later, 2nd, 3rd century. That's
right,
not this time period. This time period is 1st century.
Well, I'm saying that there are lots of different Jews who wrote interpretations of what they think the Messiah is. There are lots of different Messiahs at the time period. So you had a lot of options to choose from within the Jewish community of potential Messiah candidates. And so it seems like of all of the different variations of Judaism at the time period, Romans could have picked one to support rather than invent their own to support. And that seems like it would explain why there's more contradictions, why there's a lot of knowledge of Jewish history and references to the Old Testament, which I wouldn't expect the Romans to have that kind of knowledge about Jewish history, that they would be able to make some kinds of allegories towards this new Messiah thing.
Which is where the Jewish scribes come in, because they're the ones who did have that knowledge.
The Romans were the Flavians, they were in cahoots actually. The Alexanders, where Philo came from, they had those intellectuals and those scribes, and Titus himself his girlfriend was in that family.
I mean, Philo's son was Titus's first general who helped him destroy the temple. So we're talking, famous scribes and famous powerful Jewish families are aiding the Roman cause because they saw it helping them to stay in power too. These powerful Jews had properties to protect, wanted to protect their positions in society. So they found it better to go along with the Romans. And they wanted to see an end to the extremism that was tearing apart their culture too. So that's why they cooperated. And
I would agree. I would agree with all of that. But why invent a new version and not use one of the already existing versions in Judaism?
It's possible that they did.
It's possible
they one of the existing messiahs. Now, we're talking about before all of these other alternate gospels were written. So, in other words, the Flavians could not choose from all the various gospels that were written 100 or 200 years later. That came later. When they were around, when it was Flavian rule, there wasn't a whole bunch of different gospels about a Jesus character.
All you have is the Paul material, really, at that point.
The Paul material.
And
there were some Gnostics, but that's under controversy. Some people peg the Gnostics as later. Some say maybe they started end of first century. So there really was no other Christian literature.
And then you have the Romans. See, once they settle on these four gospels, all the other literature they go out and destroy. That's why we found them in these hidden caves and things. Now we almost didn't find them. The Dead Sea Scrolls or the Nag Hammadis. We could have never found those. They could have been lost to history. But we did luckily find them, and then we see all these things that basically, because the Romans were going around destroying all that stuff. They had a focus to want to bring it down to this core ideology, and Atwell's point of view is that they only wanted the stuff that had this, what he calls the Flavin Signature in it, which was their
that part of Atwell's thesis I find very compelling, and it's worth mentioning that if you go through the Gospels like Joe does in his book, and there are certain references to certain words, figures, characters, activities that were mentioned in the Josephus's account of the Flavians' battle during the War of the Jews. And it seems like Jesus is moving through Judea in the exact same order as Titus is during the battle with the War of the Jews. And similar characters, similar activities, similar places and locations are all listed in parallel between the War of the Jews, the history of the War of the Jews, and the New Testament. And that really makes you think, well, gosh, who would put that in there? It's got to be the Roman emperors who wanted to be, commemorated, memorialized in this new literature, or at least possibly some Jewish scribes that were wanting to create a god cult of these Caesars and created this literature to glorify them by commemorating that war in a way that you wouldn't know that you're commemorating the victor that destroyed Jerusalem. So I thought that was compelling.
Yeah, but going back to the Son of Man, because Titus is the only person that does those three things that Jesus predicts are going to happen by the Son of Man.
He destroys the towns of Galilee, destroys the temple.
He builds the wall around Jerusalem and destroys Jerusalem. So, and it's an odd thing for, if you're the Messiah, why would you even want to destroy Jerusalem? But if you're a Roman who's
threatening
to subdue
get the
this
people
culture
under control.
Yeah. So it's just putting all the pieces in place and taking a step back. Then it starts to paint a picture that's very compelling, I think. And like I said, we don't know for an actual fact, but we certainly don't know from just the Gospels, because they're, like you say, they're contradictory. They're not they're anonymous works, for that matter, and supposedly written decades after Christ even lived, and we know how information can easily get distorted.
Even if there were eyewitnesses that were trying to take down accounts of what Jesus did, why wait 40 years to start writing it down? You would think somebody would be right there, trying to write down what this great man did, or at least as soon as he was killed or something. So it's a mystery.
We have several questions from the audience. Joking Atheist asks, why did nobody at the time come out with the Roman Empire and say that they had made this up? If there are whistleblowers, it's a large enterprise in order to make up a figurehead. And so you would expect to have some of the people in that secret society actually leak the information. Why don't we see any of those?
If there were whistleblowers, I imagine they would have been put to death and everything they wrote destroyed. That's how the Romans ruled. But we don't know. We have no idea. Did you have something to say?
No, not really. No, it's a good point. But, so much information. It definitely got focused, because when you look at Josephus is really the main source we have for that whole first century, and he was the court historian for the Flavians. So we have to rely on that book to really understand that era.
That alone, just showing that there's no other written history from that era. What happened to any other written histories that might have been written? They were probably destroyed. And maybe someday in another 100 years, someone will find something in a cave again. Who knows?
Yeah.
The accounts of the whistleblowers. The gospel according to the whistleblowers.
Question from Aaron Flower. He says he agrees with Bart Ehrman's take. Do you have an interpretation or response to the criticisms of Price, Ehrman, and Carrier on?
Yeah. Well, all those guys are brilliant guys, and obviously none of them believe that Jesus. Bart. It's possible that there was a Jesus person, but kind of like James Valiant puts it, he says okay, let's say there was a Jesus person that lived, but that's not what the Gospels tell the story of. The Gospels are literature, and they've created this particular version of maybe it could have been based on somebody real, but it's not that person really. It's this unique literal literature version.
Yeah.
And that's the one we're dealing with, and that's the one that kind of affected history. And you have this domination of Europe with this religion coming out of from there, and
James Valiant says that if there had been a real historical Jesus that was crucified, he was crucified. The only people that the Romans crucified were people that were working against Rome to try to topple the government or some kind of subversive activity. They wouldn't have crucified him if he was roaming the countryside saying, pay your taxes, give to Caesar what is Caesar's.
Turn the other cheek.
Turn the other cheek, walk a mile for a Roman soldier. They wouldn't have crucified him for that. He's great. If he was crucified, he was probably a real Jewish rebel leader. Another one of these strings of messiahs.
Yeah, and those guys were violent.
Yeah.
They were fanatical. Zealots, that's where the word zealot comes from. That was the name of their tribe. The Zealots and the Sicarii.
Jerry Pina says, super chat, thank you for the super chat. There are several references in Gospels that are pro-Roman, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and the Roman soldier having better faith than the disciples. Could you talk a little bit about those?
Oh boy, this is really scholarly. This is a question for a scholar, not for a filmmaker.
We actually do address it in our new film, because we have a new movie coming out.
Based on the book.
We're just about to release it.
Warren Fay and James Valiant.
This is kind of becoming, our favorite subject, but we're also, and I know you just interviewed James just recently, but he addresses this quite well.
James and Warren went about their own scholarship, their own research, and came to the same conclusion. So that just gives a little more, and they have more archaeological physical evidence, because Joe relies on the interpretation of the text, and he does an amazing, brilliant, in-depth analysis in his book of the text. So he would get into this stuff here.
Well, Jerry's right. I know what he was referring to here, and it's a great point that again, you have a Roman that's more pious in a sense than a
any
Jew.
Jew that I've ever seen. I think that's the quote that Jesus says.
It still just points to the Roman bias of the work. But
yeah.
But like Neil said earlier, we're not scholars, we're researchers, and we love this stuff, but we can't speak to it at the depth of. We kind of rely on our scholars. So when we're making the film, we're relying on them to keep us.
I mean, we learned a lot in the process of doing it, so we can speak to some of it, but
yeah, we find it fascinating.
We don't pretend to be the scholars.
Yeah, but Jerry makes a great point there.
Gotcha. Church of Entropy asks, do you think the Trinity is a pagan concept?
Mm-mm.
Well, it's certainly not monotheistic. The Jews don't accept it whatsoever. I mean, it's crazy. The Holy Spirit and the Holy Ghost. I mean, it's.
Yeah, that's definitely not a Jewish idea.
I would say it's pagan just on the fact that it's they believe in more than one God.
Of course, Joe Atwill makes the point that Vespasian was deified, so he was worshipped as a god after his death, and that made Titus the son of God. So you have the idea of God and son of God already in the Roman imperial cult. Now, we don't know who the Holy Spirit is. Joe kind of thought maybe it was the second son, Domitian.
Domitian, because he was kind of a holy terror in Rome. He was a bit of another Caligula type.
He unfortunately, martyred anybody that was Christian within the Flavian family, and that's where the first Christians came from the Flavian family, which is another point that points to the Flavians having the origin of, creating the origin. The very first evidence, physical archaeological evidence we have for Christianity is the catacombs of Saint Domitilla. Domitilla is the granddaughter of Vespasian. She is the niece of Titus. So it is a family catacomb that becomes the first Christian catacomb.
It's sort of a family business when you look at it from that perspective, that came out of the Flavian family, early Christianity.
Yes, so the Holy Spirit could possibly be this Jesus figure that they created in the literature, or it could be the spirit of the literature that is trying to pacify the extremist Jews. We don't know. And as far as earlier pagan concepts of the Trinity,
I haven't.
I can't speak to that. We just don't know.
All right. There was one last question. It was Ashley. I thought some Jews accepted other gods existed, but their God was the highest one. I think there were accounts of like Jews or Jewish temples that had like Roman gods or Greek gods or something in them, and that they had polytheism kind of.
Yeah, there's some really interesting stuff.
According to our scholars, they would not allow any statues.
But that's at that period. But if you go earlier, one of the books before I discovered Joe's book on Caesar's Messiah was The Bible on Earth by Israel Finkelstein, and he does a great job here.
He's a Jewish author
he's a top archaeologist in Israel, right? But what he said he did is, instead of going out to sites and doing investigations with the Bible in one hand, and his other tools in the other, he put the Bible down and said, just what does the data tell me, and he pretty much completely debunks the entire Old Testament as being mythology, and it comes from all these different sources. It's not even original to Jewish culture. So yeah, I think in the earlier periods of Jewish history, they like God has a girlfriend, and there's other gods too. Baal, they sacrifice children to Baal, and there's El, and so in a sense, as it evolved, but it kind of coalesced by the time we get into this Roman period. It's pretty, it's very monotheistic, and the idea of Caesar being a god is completely intolerable, because you basically have to bow down to the God of the Jews at that point. He's the God of the universe as far as they're concerned, and they will have no other god.
Gotcha. Well, we have been going for about an hour. Really appreciate you guys coming on. It was a great conversation. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find out more about your work?
Sure. So we have our film is CaesarsMessiahDoc.com. that's where you can go. And we have it up on YouTube. You're welcome to watch it. It's on Gaia. It's on Amazon. This is actually this month is the 10-year anniversary of when that film came out.
Yeah, we premiered at a theater in Los Angeles, and we did do a small tour around California. There was a showing in New York.
We had a huge one in London. Where the
Richard Dawkins.
Richard Dawkins, he tweeted it. And he gave us a massive boost. But
so it enjoyed a great popularity at the time that we released it. So 10 years ago at the end of September. And we're just so happy that there's still people interested and supporting this work. And
so we're going to build on the momentum here with it. And so keep your eyes out. The Creating Christ doc will be coming out in a month or so.
We're going to create a website and a YouTube channel, a Facebook page.
So it'll get another perspective of the same kind of idea. And like I said, you've interviewed James, so you kind of got a sense of his knowledge base.
And we appreciate, Tom, that you are bringing all of this forward to your audience. So thanks for having us. Appreciate being here.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again, guys. I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Well, thank you.
Same to you.
Same to you.